What's up, everyone? In this video, I'm going to show you how to create a Harry Potter API using Node, Express.js, and DynamoDB. It's going to be so easy. It's almost like it's magic. Shoo. All right, so before we get started, I want to give a shout out to my friend Brian Morrison and specifically his YouTube channel. Brian gave me the idea for this video and then some tips on how to get set up with DynamoDB. So credit to him in this video, but you should check him out because he's got amazing videos himself. He's one of the most underrated YouTubers, I would say. I've watched a ton of his videos on Node and Express, on Vue, on Discord bots, super cool. So if you're interested in other cool content from really good creators, go and check out Brian Morrison on YouTube as well. All right, the one other quick thing I want to share is that recently Amy Dutton and I announced that we are starting a podcast called Compressed FM. At the time of creating this video, we are recording our first episodes and they will be live in the middle of April 2021. So if you're interested in a new podcast on web development and web design and anything else that you can think of, go and check us out at Compressed FM. The link is in the description below. Keep in mind, we also take grab bag questions where if you have questions that you specifically want answered, you can submit them to us and we'll answer them live on the podcast. So go and check it out at compressed.fm. All right, so let's go ahead and build this thing out. The first thing you need to know is that there is a GitHub repository. A link to that is in the description below with all the source code for this project. So if you need help getting things set up or you need to double check something, you can always refer back to the source code in addition to the video. Now, the other thing we want to look at first is the existing Harry Potter API because we're going to grab data from the existing API and then bring it into our own. So this is at hp-api.herokuapp.com. And what we're going to do is we're going to grab information from that API, put it in our database, and then create our own API around it using Node.js, Express.js, and then the data stored in DynamoDB. So if you're curious where this data comes from and then what it looks like, you can hit this endpoint /API/characters and go and see the same information. That's the kind of stuff that we're going to work with. So you'll have a link below to the Harry Potter API. So that is that part. And then first thing we want to do is actually create our DynamoDB, our Dynamo database inside of AWS. Now, really quickly on AWS, it can do a lot of different things. This is one of the good things and the things that's a little bit intimidating with AWS is just how much it can do. But we're specifically working with DynamoDB, a NoSQL database to store basically collections instead of formally structured SQL content. So this is a little bit more familiar for people who have worked with something like MongoDB for storing collections and objects instead of like rows and tables per se. So I'm going to go ahead and sign into the console here. Let me go ahead and get signed in to AWS. All right, so I am signed in now. Now what we want to do is find the DynamoDB section here. It's popping up for me, but if it's not popping up, if you haven't used it recently, you can search for DynamoDB and then go and click on it that way. And once that loads, under the table section, you'll see that I've already got a Harry Potter characters table. So what I'm going to do is just to make sure we're starting from scratch, let's go ahead and click that. And then go to delete table. So I'm going to delete that whole thing to make sure we are starting from scratch together. All right, so now that that is gone, let's go ahead and create our table. We'll give a table name of Harry Potter API, maybe. And then our partition key, our primary key is going to be the ID column. So that's what we're going to have. The property on each object that's going to be the primary key is the ID column. And it's going to have a type of string. All right, so that looks like it should be good to go. We can take the default settings here. Another thing to remember or notice is which region we are in. So we're in US-East-1 on my screen. Make sure you note which one you are in because you'll need that here in a second. So we'll go ahead and create that table. All right, looks like that thing is created. Cool, so we have our table created. We have our Harry Potter API table created. Now we need to add a user to this so that we can have access to the database. And to do that, if you come up to the search bar at the top, you can search for users and then come down to the features and then IAM, which is Identity Access Management feature. We'll go into users. You'll see that I have a couple of users here anyway. So I have the HP admin. This is the previous user that I was using. So I'm going to delete that one. And then I'll go ahead and add a new user. So this will be now, I'll just spell out Harry Potter admin. We'll make sure to do the programmatic access. We'll go next to permissions, and this is going to decide what should it be able to do. And we can attach this to existing policies directly. And we'll go ahead and give this administrator access. Now, this is not necessarily recommended for going to production because you want to limit the scope of permissions for your different users. This is just an easy way for us to get started with users. So we'll add administrator access to this user, which will basically give it everything that it could need. And then we'll keep going through the next options here. All right, and then we'll create the user. And what we're looking for in the end is we want to have our access key ID and then our secret access key. Those are the things that we're looking for. All right, so we have our table set up. We then have our user set up. Now let's actually get into the code and start to work with it there. All right, so I've got open a brand new folder here, and I'm going to go ahead and initialize this as a JavaScript project. So npm init, let me make this a little bit bigger for you. There we go. So we'll do an npm init, and we'll say -y, and this is going to be, this will create our package.json for us with whatever the name of your folder is. So my name was HP API. And then we need to install our dependencies. So we're going to use, we're in Node, we're going to use Express, and then we're going to use a few other things. We'll use the AWS SDK, we'll use .env for environment variables, and then we'll use Axios as well. So let's do an npm install AWS SDK, Axios.env, and Express. We'll use all of those. And we're going to start with just creating a file that can start to work with DynamoDB. So let's do a Dynamo.js. And this will give us our ability to start working with our new table that we just created. So let's go into this code, and we'll do const. We'll get AWS from the AWS SDK. We will also, to be able to use our environment variables, which we'll set up in a second, we will need to require the .env package and then call its config function. So what this will do is it will allow us to load in variables from the .env file and then reference them inside of Node with process.env. So why don't we go ahead and do that? Let's create our .env file. And in the source code, you have a sample .env file, and it's got these three different properties. It's got the AWS access key ID, the AWS secret access key, and the AWS default region. So let's go back to AWS. We see for the user, we have our access key ID. So let's put that in there. There's our access key. And then there's the secret access key. So let's copy that one and put it in. And then let's put in our region, which mine, if you recall, turned out to be US East 1. Now you would need to double check inside of your table. Let's go back to that for a second. Let's search Dynamo in here. If you click into tables and go into your table, to make sure, you'll see in the upper right, you'll see this drop down, and you can see US East 1 is mine there. All right, so those are the credentials that we need there. Now we can continue to connect to the actual database itself. So after we've got those imports, now we need to call aws.config.update, and then we'll pass it our config parameter. So our region is going to be process.env, and then this is going to be the AWS default region. Now again, this is coming from, these environment variables are coming from the .env file. Notice those names are the same, but we have access to them from using this .env package. So we'll also have the access key ID will be process.env/a or .aws access key ID. Typing these things is the worst. All right, there we go. And then lastly, we'll have the secret access key, process env, and then AWS secret access key. Now, I did want to make sure to go ahead and do this step in here of requiring .env and using .env files, because these are credentials that you don't want to check into your source code. You never want to check in secret access keys or API keys, things like that, into your source code. So this will allow us to keep them out of the source code. And then at the end of the video, if you'd like to know how to host this and get it deployed, let me know in the comments, and we'll look at doing a second video for that. All right, so that's our AWS config. Now we want to create the Dynamo client. So we'll do a new, we'll take AWS, we'll call DynamoDB, and then we'll call document client function. And we'll say that the table name, I'm creating this kind of like a constant here with the syntax of uppercase and underscore. We'll call this, let's make sure we got the right name here, Harry Potter API. And I'm going to copy and paste that into here. So we've got our connection to AWS. This user has access to do everything. Again, not something I would recommend when you go to production. And then we're creating the client that's going to connect to the document store for DynamoDB. And then we're specifying here's the table name that we want to connect to. So let's start with running one function. Let's do a get characters function. And this is going to be an async function. And what we'll need to do for each one of these is create a params object. And in this params object, in this case, we specifically need to say which table name we're going to be querying from. So we'll put that in the params, and then we'll say characters equals, we await this, we're using async await here. And then we'll call our Dynamo client, we'll call scan, pass in params. Scan will do basically a read or a look. And then we'll tack on the promise here that we can async await this, and then we can return the characters. So if we were to test this, we could call, and maybe let's log this out as well. Let's do a log out of the characters. We could call this down here, get characters, and that should log it out for us. So we're not going to actually see any data because we don't have anything in our table. We'll take a look at that in a second. But we should be able to make this connection, do a read, and then just see an empty array. So let's do I'm going to use Nodemon. This is a package that will continue to reload Node applications as you save files, and you can npm install -g Nodemon to be able to use this as well. So I'm going to call Nodemon on the Dynamo file. So let's do Dynamo Nodemon, and it looks like we have our first error of the day. Await is only available inside of an async function. Actually, got the syntax wrong for this, so it should be async and then our parameters here. Otherwise, it looked at the variable inside this parameter being async. So what comes back from this characters is an object that has items with an empty array. So the items is the stuff that came back. So what we probably want to do is add a character, maybe ourselves manually, just to see how this thing works. And then we can actually be able to do that read. So let's create a new function, add or update character. And this is going to be an async function again. We're going to take in a parameter of character. And we're using arrow functions here if you're new to that syntax. So we will do our params just like we just did, where we'll specify the table name. That's a capital T. All right, and then also the item that we want to either save or update will be the character that we passed in here. So with those params, now we can do await Dynamo client dot put. We will pass in those params, and then we'll convert this to a promise again. And we can actually just return that directly. So what we're doing is we're passing in a character. We are using our client to call a put. This will either add a new character to the database, or it will update an existing character depending on the ID of this character. All right, so that should be good. So let's comment out the get for now. And let's create a Harry Potter object. And I'm going to go and look in the API. Let's look in this one here. I'm going to grab all the information for Harry Potter. I'm going to copy this over, and we'll get an easier way to get all this information over in a second. So here's all the information for Harry Potter. What I want to make sure I do is add in the ID of 0. So he's going to be the first character. So there's Harry Potter, and then we can call, we don't need a comma there. We can call the add or update character and pass in HP. All right, so this should run. It looks like we got another error here. Let's do a check. Oh, and the ID, I did this before in testing. The ID here should be a string instead of a number. And that's because of the way when we set the table up, we define that primary key to be of type string. So I'll save this. Notice when I save, it reruns with Nodemon, and it looks like everything went okay. So now I'll comment out the add or update, and then I'll comment in the get character. Now we can see that that comes back with items, and then inside of items is our one Harry Potter object, which is pretty sweet. So we are now connected to the Harry Potter API table in DynamoDB. And if you click in items, you can now see all of that information in here. So all those properties that we just saved, you can see them right here inside of DynamoDB. Now, all of this information was just for testing. So let's get rid of these things right now. And let's add a few more functions. So we want the ability to get a character by its ID. So we'll pass in, we'll do an async function. We'll pass in the ID that we're looking for. And then we'll do our params. And then we'll also pass in the key object, and it's going to be looking for the ID. So key is going to be an object here, and we're looking for records that have the specific ID that have passed into this function. Then we can return await Dynamo client.get, pass in our params, and then convert that to a promise again. All right, so we've got get all characters, we've got get character by ID, we have the add or update character, and lastly, we need the delete character. So this will look very familiar. Why don't we just copy one of these, because we're typing out a lot. So let's do, this is going to be a delete character. It's going to take in an ID. And actually, we should have copied the one that we just did, because it's going to look like this. Let's do that. Let's copy this key object. And this is saying, hey, we want to delete the thing in this table that has this ID. And then we pass it in as our params. And then instead of a put, now we are calling a delete. Now you can see how these correlate to kind of your basic CRUD operations: create, read, update, and delete. All right, so we're not going to do all of this information inside of our Dynamo.js file. What we want to do is export these functions, and we'll use them inside of our application file in Express. So we'll export the Dynamo client, the get characters, the get character by ID, add or update character, and delete character. So now we've got all of our connection and our helper functions in here inside of this Dynamo file to help us be able to do whatever we need to from our Express endpoints. The other thing we want to do, though, is we talked about, we don't want to manually copy over all of this information. Let's go ahead and delete this to start, actually. Let's delete this record. We don't want to copy all this information. Why don't we create a little seed function? Seeding is where you go and populate a database with some information. So why don't we create a seed function here? Let's kill our server. Let's kill this one. Let's create a new file called seed.js. We're going to use Axios, and what this is going to do is it's going to make an HTTP request to the existing HP endpoint to get all of those characters. We'll get the add or update character function. Remember, we just exported that inside of our Dynamo file. All right. And then we'll create a function called seed.data, which will be an async function. And at the end of this, we'll call seed.data. So what this is going to do is it's going to make a request to that Harry Potter API, and then it's going to grab all that data, transform it, and then be able to save it in our own database. And this is going to be kind of cool. So let's copy in the URL. So this is the URL that is in the description below for where you get these characters. Then we want to handle, if something goes wrong, we at least want to error out this error. And we're using try catch in here. And inside the try, it says, okay, go ahead and try these things. If anything goes wrong, if there's any errors, catch them and then handle them in some way. And often I like to do something like this. Something went wrong. That's you'll see things like that a lot in my code. All right, so we have our try catch. Now we want to get the data from the axios.get with that URL. And what that's going to return is a response object that has a data property that we want. But we can also go ahead and destructure this data property. So this is basically the equivalent of getting that response, res, and then calling res.data. So we're able to get this all in one thing. And then I'm going to alias this, a couple of tricks in here. I'm going to alias this so it's not just generically data. What it's saying is I want to get the data property from the response and then rename that variable to characters. I think that will work pretty well. Now, the next thing we want to do is save each of these individual items into our database. And we could do this one at a time, but each one of those functions is going to be asynchronous. So if we await that save to finish, we're going to have to wait for one before we do the other, which is not ideal. So we can use something called a Promise.all, which will basically say, hey, trigger all of these requests and then let them run independently of each other at the same time. And then when they're all done, let's handle the responses. So this is maybe a little new for people, but we're going to create an array of promises. So we will take our characters, we will do a map, we'll get a reference to each character and the variable, the index I. And then inside of here, what do we want to do? Well, we want to call the add or update character. We want to pass in an object where we take all the information about the character that we're looking at. And then we want to add an ID property, which is basically going to be our index, our I, but we want it to be a string. So to convert that index to a string, we can just add on an empty string. So that will give the ID property, the primary key for each character, a string that looks like a number. It will have all of the existing properties that came from the character inside of the existing Harry Potter API. We take each one of those characters, we call add or update character. Notice we're not awaiting this. That's because we want this to return a promise so that we get an array of promises. Now, one thing I realized is I don't need these brackets in here because I'm using what's called the implicit return. And the implicit return for this arrow function says if I don't actually open up these brackets, then just assume that I'm returning whatever is called next. So this will return to us an array of promises, and then we can await all of these by await promise.all character promises. All right, so that should be enough to go ahead and populate our database with all the records that came from that existing Harry Potter API. So I'm going to use Node in this case because I just want it to run once. I'm going to call seed.js, and hopefully, if we don't have any errors, delete characters not defined. We've got something in our DynamoDB up here or in here. Hey, that's not how you spell delete. I'm sure that other people found this earlier on. So let's try to run this file again. Hey, it looks like it worked. Now let's go over to our table in DynamoDB. Let's refresh, and we should see a bunch of data in here. Hey, look, all of that data now just got copied over. I guess it's 24 records is what it is, and they're not necessarily in order in here, but that's okay. So we've got all of our data there. Now we've got our seeding done. We have our core functionality in Dynamo done. Now we can actually create the Express app. So let's go to create a new file, app.js. I've got a little snippet in here for Express app. What this will do is it will kind of do the basic parts of creating an Express application. It will get a reference to Express. It will use that Express function to create the app. It will register a hello world endpoint. We'll talk more about that in a second. And then it will start that app. So it'll tell us listen on a port. Either that thing is coming from environment variables, or we will just default that to port 3000. So this is pretty boilerplate code. You see this with almost every Express application, especially as you're getting started. So we'll kind of use that for here, and we don't actually need this one, but we can leave it for now just to make sure it's working. So why don't we go ahead and do that? Let's run nodemon app.js. It says it's listening on a port, and this means if we make a GET request to localhost 3000, we should see that hello world. So we're seeing that data come back here, which is nice. All right, so that's working. Now let's create another GET route, which will be /characters, and we'll have an async function that takes in request and response. And just to make sure the definition of these endpoints are clear, we're defining a GET endpoint at this path of /characters, and then we handle this with our async function. The handler is an async function that takes in request and response as its parameters. So let's do a try catch again, and we'll just log out this error. And then the way we return inside of Express is we do a res.status of 500 to signify that something went wrong, and then return a JSON object where we'll have an error property and say something went wrong. Super specific, I know. So we'll kind of copy and paste this over and over again, but it'll kind of give us a good foundation here. And what we want to do is do const characters, and we will await. We'll call get characters. Now notice I'm getting some auto import in here. So when I hit this, it did the import from that Dynamo function. And we can go ahead and do get characters by ID, add or update, and delete character. We'll need all of those. So we'll go ahead and import them. So this thing should be able to query all character. So this thing should be able to query all characters, and then we can return those as JSON from our Express endpoint. So now if we come back over to our slash characters, we should see that we get all these characters returned to us. Now I've got some formatting, a JSON formatter extension inside of Google Chrome, so yours may not look this pretty, but just know that that's because I've got some formatting stuff set up. But anyway, it's able to return all this stuff, which is pretty great. All right, so let's copy this because we're going to do something really similar. We're going to do a get endpoint now, but now specifically for getting a character by its ID. So we can pass in this ID in the URL, reference that ID by const ID equals rec.param. So those query params that are passed, or those route params that are passed inside of here, you can get from rec.params, and then whatever the name of that thing is here, denoted by this semicolon. So we'll get that ID, and then we want to, instead of get all characters, we want to get character by ID and pass that thing. So now let's do a slash characters slash 1 maybe. I think this should be, this is Hermione. If I did 0, this would be Harry Potter, as you'd imagine. So now we have the ability to get individual characters by their ID. And then we've got 2 more that we need to do. We need to do our create character and our, well, 3 things actually: create character, update character, and delete character. So let's start with our create character. This will be 2 slash characters as a post request. We'll take in async, rec, and res. And the one thing we need to get is the character from the rec.body. Now you can't submit data to an Express endpoint by default and be able to access it without one line of configuration. So if you're in Express and you want to be able to receive post body data or just body data, you have to call app.use and then call express.json function. So you do that, and then you'll be able to parse body data that comes inside of a post request. And then let's just copy again some of this stuff. Let's just copy this down. So instead of get character, we want to add or update character, and we'll pass in the character itself. And we'll say what it returns is the new character, and then we'll return the new character. All right, so we are calling add or update for our character. We're then returning that thing. Cool. And then something that's going to look really similar here is we will create a put endpoint. And this put endpoint is usually, put method is usually for updating. And we can specify in this route which one we're specifically going to update. And we can grab the ID property. We can destructure it, a little bit different than what we did a second ago, from rec.params. So 2 different ways to get the ID property here. Either destructure it from rec.params or type out rec.params.id. Either way is okay. And what we're going to do, just because we have our endpoint set up this way where we have that ID in the path, we're going to set the character.id to be that incoming ID. So we'll just make that happen to start. And then it's going to basically call the same thing. So this will be hopefully the updated character. And then we'll say updated character. So that will look basically the same as our post, just now we are passing in the ID as part of the route. And then lastly, we'll do our delete. So we'll do our not get, but delete here. And this will be 2 slash characters, 2 slash ID. Again, lots of similarities in these CRUD endpoints and Express. All right, so we'll have this function stubbed out. And I think we've done this enough where I'm just going to kind of copy and paste this in to speed this up a little bit. So we're going to grab this ID from the params that are coming in. We are going to call a delete character. We'll await that, and then we'll just return this response in line. All right, so we have all of our endpoints here. Now we can open up a tool like Postman to test and make sure all these things work. All right, so I've got Postman open here, and what we're using this for is the ability to make requests to an API or a server. So we'll start with the local host 3000/characters. So we're able to make requests to this that are not just get requests. So now we can do post requests as well. And I'm going to go into the body, say this is raw, and then this is JSON data. So let's create an object. We'll have an ID property of 105. And then we'll just say my name is James. So we're just creating some test data just to make sure this stuff will work. So let's send this request. We're sending a post request to /characters with this ID. Let's go ahead and send this. Hopefully that looks okay. So it returns empty object. I think that's what that returns by default. So let's go and check now inside of here. If we make a request to 105 was the ID, hopefully we get back the ID of James. Cool. Or the ID of 105 with the name of James. So that works. And then what if we wanted to do a put request? So we wanted to update this to James Quick. Let's send this request on again. Okay, looks like we can't put requests. Oh, that's because we need the /ID in here. So /105. Let's go ahead and do that. And then we'll refresh this query up here. So James Quick, cool, that updates. And then lastly, let's do a delete. So let's do a delete in here. We don't need any data. We can send this request to /character /105. That comes back as nothing. And this query should now return nothing as well. There's nothing there at 105. So in a few minutes, we were able to set up a database, DynamoDB database in AWS. We were able to seed this with data from the existing Harry Potter API. Then we were able to create all the CRUD operations with Dynamo and then tie that into our app.js into RESTful routes or CRUD routes, get, post, put, delete inside of Node and Express. All right, so we just built a full Harry Potter API using Node, Express, and DynamoDB in about 30 minutes. We covered some cool topics in JavaScript. We learned how to seed our database. We talked about Promise.all, endpoints, RESTful routing, CRUD operations, all that fun stuff. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel so you can find out more content in the future. And I've got a question for you. Would you like to know how to host this API somewhere like Heroku or something like that? If you'd like to know how to host this Node API, let me know in the comments below and we'll think about doing a video as a follow-up to this one to show you how to host it. Anyways, hope you enjoyed it and I'll catch you next time.